Spring, 356 BCE, the skies over Pella, the proud yet modest capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia, glowed under the first light of dawn. Across the endless fields of barley, morning dew clung to each stalk, and the distant rhythm of horse hooves echoed like nature's own music. Within the white stone palace, built more for strength than for luxury, joyful news spread like wildfire. Queen Olympias had given birth to a prince. Legends tell of an omen the night before Alexander's birth. The great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, suddenly burst into flames. Whispering soothsayers declared it a sign. A man had been born to conquer the world. King Philip II, Alexander's father, stood over his newborn son with a fire in his eyes. This child will not only rule Macedonia, he will rule everything. A childhood forged in ambition, Alexander's upbringing was not one of idle comfort. His father, Philip II, was a brilliant strategist and military reformer who transformed Macedonia from a fragile state into a dominant military power in Greece. But he was also a stern father, a man who valued discipline over tenderness, and he demanded his son be stronger, sharper, and braver than any other. His mother, Olympias, was a very different influence. A princess from Epirus, she filled Alexander's young mind with tales from Greek mythology. She told him of Achilles, the hero of Troy, and instilled in him the belief that the blood of gods ran through his veins. Olympias herself was convinced that Alexander was descended from Zeus, and she often whispered to him, "You were born to surpass all men." From an early age, Alexander's sharp mind and fierce will were unmistakable. But it was one event at the age of 12 that first etched his name into legend. The day he tamed Bucephalus. Bucephalus, the symbol of courage. One bright morning, a massive black horse was brought before King Philip. The animal was worth a fortune, yet it reared and lashed out violently, throwing every rider who dared mount it. The king's officers shook their heads. "Sire, this beast cannot be ridden." But young Alexander, slender and not yet 13, stepped forward with unwavering eyes. He noticed something the seasoned warriors had missed. The horse was not vicious. It was terrified, frightened by the shadow it cast. Gently, Alexander turned Bucephalus to face the sun, soothing it with a steady voice, before leaping onto its back in a swift, daring motion. The horse bolted, hooves thundering, but the boy clung on, guiding it with flawless control. Before the crowd's astonished eyes, Bucephalus returned, calm under his new master. King Philip embraced his son, his voice thick with emotion. "My son, Macedonia is too small for you. Seek a kingdom worthy of yourself." It was one of the rare moments Alexander saw pure pride in his father's eyes. The master of knowledge, Aristotle. At 13, Alexander was sent to Mysa to study under the greatest philosopher of his time, Aristotle. Here, among shaded groves and marble colonnades, Alexander devoured lessons in philosophy, mathematics, science, medicine, literature, and most importantly, the art of leadership. Aristotle nurtured in him an insatiable curiosity and a belief that knowledge was as powerful a weapon as the sword. Alexander carried with him, for the rest of his life, a copy of Homer's Iliad, a gift from Aristotle. It became his constant companion on campaigns, a reminder of the heroism he sought to emulate, a complicated bond with the king. While Alexander admired his father's military genius, he also lived under Philip's vast shadow. Every Macedonian victory was a reminder that the throne was still far from the young prince's grasp. Banquets in the royal court, overflowing with wine and boasting, often ended in tension between father and son, especially after Philip remarried and produced another male heir. Their relationship was a blend of love, rivalry, and unspoken challenge. Deep down, Alexander knew that to fulfill his destiny, he would one day have to step out from under his father's towering legacy. The fire of ambition ignites by the end of his teenage years. Alexander had become a master horseman, a gifted tactician, and, most dangerously, a man who believed that the world had no boundaries. Tales of the vast riches of Persia and the glory of distant lands filled his imagination. He began to see himself not merely as the future king of Macedonia, but as a ruler destined to leave his mark on the entire known world. No one could have foreseen that the boy who once tamed a wild black stallion would one day ride it across deserts, over mountains and through rivers, carving an empire that stretched to the very edges of the ancient map. The summer of 336 BCE in Macedonia was meant to be a season of celebration. King Philip II had returned victorious from campaigns in Greece, and preparations were underway for the grand wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to the king of Epirus. Nobles from across Greece and beyond gathered in the city of Iga, the old royal capital, their armor polished, their robes adorned with gold and purple. But behind the laughter of banquets and the blare of trumpets, whispers of intrigue swirled like storm clouds. The day the king fell on the morning of the wedding, King Philip walked through the crowd toward the theater, basking in the adoration of his subjects. His bodyguards, proud veterans, flanked him closely. Yet in that moment of joy, Philip chose to stride alone, believing himself untouchable. Then, in an instant, celebration turned to chaos. A young nobleman, Pausanias, lunged forward, a dagger flashing in the sun. The blade sank deep into Philip's chest. The king stumbled, eyes wide in disbelief, and fell to the ground before his people. Screams tore through the air. The assassin was cut down within moments, but the damage was done. Macedonia's king lay dead. A prince in peril. News spread like wildfire, and within hours, the kingdom teetered on the brink of civil war. Philip's sudden death left a dangerous vacuum. Enemies inside and outside the court saw their chance. Rival claimants, powerful generals, and rebellious Greek cities, each moved to secure their own advantage. At just 20 years old, Alexander was thrust into the center of this maelstrom. Some questioned his youth, others his legitimacy. And yet, Alexander did not falter. Standing before the Macedonian army, veterans who had fought under his father, he spoke with a voice that carried far beyond his years. "My father built this kingdom with blood and iron. I will not see it torn apart." The soldiers, seeing in him the same fierce spirit as Philip, pounded their shields and shouted their loyalty. Alexander was proclaimed king. Fire across Greece. The moment Alexander took the throne, the embers of rebellion flared. In the south, Thebes, Athens, and other Greek states rose against Macedonia, believing the young king would be too inexperienced to stop them. Across the northern borders, Thracian tribes threatened to invade. Alexander knew he had no time to mourn. Wearing his armor and mounting Bucephalus, he led a lightning campaign through the Balkans, crushing revolts before they could gather strength. His speed and decisiveness stunned both allies and enemies. The fall of Thebes. When news reached him that Thebes, one of Greece's proudest and most defiant cities, had openly rebelled, Alexander acted without hesitation. He marched south with a force so swift that Thebes barely had time to prepare. After a brief but ferocious siege, the city walls were breached. What happened next would become both a warning and a legend. Thebes was razed to the ground. Its buildings burned, its people sold into slavery, and the land divided among Macedonia's allies. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message to the rest of Greece was clear. Alexander would show no mercy to those who defied him. A kingdom secured by the end of that campaign. Every Greek city-state, including Athens, had sworn allegiance to Alexander. He was appointed supreme commander of the Hellenic League, a coalition of Greek states united under Macedonia's leadership. This gave him more than just a secure homeland. It gave him an army that stretched across Greece. But Alexander's mind was already turning beyond his borders. He intended not only to rule Greece, but to lead it on a campaign that would eclipse even his father's dreams. A campaign to conquer the vast and ancient Persian Empire. The gathering storm in the winter of 336 BCE, as snow blanketed the mountains. Alexander stood on the ramparts of Pella's palace, looking eastward. The lands he sought were immense. Deserts, rivers, cities of gold, and armies that dwarfed anything Greece had ever faced. Yet, in the young king's heart, there was no doubt. His father had once told him that Macedonia was too small for him. Now, with the crown on his head and the loyalty of Greece at his back, Alexander was ready to prove it. The storm that had brought him to power was only the beginning. The true tempest, the one that would sweep across the ancient world, was about to break. Spring, 334 BCE, the cold winds of winter had faded, and the waters of the Hellespont shimmered beneath a pale blue sky. Along the coastline, the Macedonian army gathered, 40,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, engineers, supply wagons, and countless camp followers. Armor glinted in the sun, banners snapped in the wind, and the sound of hammering hooves shook the ground. This was no ordinary campaign. This was the beginning of a war that would decide the fate of empires. A leap into Asia. The Hellespont, now known as the Dardanelles, was more than a narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. It was a symbolic threshold between the known world and the vast, mysterious East. Alexander knew the moment he crossed it, there would be no turning back. Standing at the prow of his flagship, he gazed toward the distant shore, where the lands of Asia Minor stretched under a rising sun. The air was heavy with salt and anticipation. Behind him, his generals, Parmenion, Antipater, and others, waited for the order. Before the crossing, Alexander made a detour. He sailed to the ancient city of Troy to pay homage at the tomb of Achilles, the hero he had idolized since boyhood. Kneeling before the grave, he offered a garland and declared, "Bless me, Achilles, for I will carry your glory further than any man has dreamed." He took a sacred shield from the temple, intending to carry it into battle as a symbol of divine favor. The Persian shadow. Across the waters, the Persian satraps of Asia Minor had been watching. The great King Darius III, ruler of the Persian Empire, commanded an army whose size and wealth dwarfed anything Alexander had faced. The Persians, however, underestimated the young Macedonian. They saw him as a reckless boy leading an overconfident army far from home. But Alexander's strategy was clear: strike hard, strike fast, and shatter the Persian defenses before they could unite their forces. The Battle of the Granicus barely had the Macedonian army set foot on Asian soil, when scouts reported the Persians massing near the river Granicus. The enemy cavalry, glittering in bronze and silk, lined the far bank, their spears angled like a wall of death. The river's current was swift, its banks steep. Crossing under enemy fire seemed suicidal. Alexander, however, saw opportunity where others saw danger. Ignoring the advice of Parmenion to wait until morning, he ordered an immediate attack. Mounting Bucephalus, he rode to the front lines, the white plumes of his helmet marking him for all to see. With a shout, the Macedonian cavalry plunged into the icy river. Water surged around their horses' flanks as Persian arrows hissed through the air. Alexander led the charge, his spear striking down the first enemy commander he met. The fighting was brutal, steel clashing, hooves trampling, shields splintering. At one point, a Persian noble raised his sword to strike Alexander from behind, but Cletus the Black, one of his trusted officers, intercepted the blow, saving the king's life. Moments later, the Persian cavalry broke, retreating in chaos. The price of victory by nightfall, the banks of the Granicus were littered with the dead. Thousands of Persians lay slain. The Macedonian losses were far fewer, but among them were noble sons of Greece. Alexander personally honored the fallen, sending their names back to their cities and ordering statues erected for the bravest. More than a military victory, the Granicus was a psychological triumph. News of the battle spread quickly, shaking Persian authority in Asia Minor. Several cities opened their gates to Alexander without resistance, preferring the favor of the new conqueror to the wrath of the defeated satraps. A hero's march in the weeks that followed. The Macedonian army moved through Asia Minor like a storm. City after city fell, some through battle, others through diplomacy. Alexander spared those who surrendered, rewarding loyalty, but he crushed resistance without mercy. The soldiers began to believe they were marching with a man favored by the gods. Even the Persians started to whisper of the young king's invincibility. Looking eastward, by the end of the campaign season, Alexander stood on a hilltop overlooking the plains of Phrygia. The horizon seemed endless, and beyond it lay the heart of the Persian Empire. His men were tired but exhilarated. Their confidence in their king had grown with every mile. The crossing of the Hellespont was more than a military maneuver. It was the moment Alexander stepped out of his father's shadow and into the light of his own destiny. The war for Asia had begun, and nothing would stop him from driving deeper into the empire of Darius. Autumn, 331 BCE. For over 3 years, Alexander had swept across Asia like an unstoppable tide, from the Granicus to Issus, from the liberation of Egypt to the gates of the Persian heartland. Now, the final confrontation with King Darius III was at hand. The fate of the Persian Empire, and perhaps the ancient world itself, would be decided on the dusty plains of Gaugamela. The gathering armies. Darius had learned from his earlier defeats. At Issus, his vast numbers had been trapped in narrow terrain. At Gaugamela, he would not make the same mistake. The great king chose a wide, flat plain in northern Mesopotamia, perfect for deploying his massive army. Reports claimed his forces numbered over 200,000 men, cavalry, infantry, archers, and the terrifying war chariots fitted with scything blades. Some sources even spoke of elephants brought from India. Alexander's army, in contrast, was a fraction of that size, around 47,000 men. Yet every soldier was battle-hardened, forged in the crucible of years of relentless campaigning. More importantly, every soldier believed their king could lead them to victory against impossible odds. The night before battle, on the eve of battle, the Macedonians made camp under the stars. The air was cold and still. Some soldiers sharpened their spears in silence. Others whispered prayers to the gods. Alexander, calm as ever, walked among them, speaking words of encouragement. He reminded them of their victories, of the Granicus, of Issus, of their march through Egypt where even the priests had called him son of the gods. That night, Darius' camp blazed with torchlight, restless and noisy. Alexander's camp, by contrast, was quiet. When Parmenion urged an attack under cover of darkness, Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory. I will win in the light of day, so all the world will see." The morning of destiny at dawn, a pale sun rose over the plain, casting long shadows across the earth. Alexander rode Bucephalus to the front, wearing a plumed helmet that gleamed in the light. His troops formed the familiar phalanx in the center, with cavalry poised on the flanks. Alexander himself took command of the right wing, the position from which he would strike the decisive blow. Across the field, Darius stood in his ornate chariot at the heart of his army. The Persian lines stretched far beyond the Macedonian flanks, a sea of spears, bows, and chariots ready to engulf the smaller force. The clash begins. The Persians opened with their war chariots, thundering forward to slice through the Macedonian lines. Alexander had anticipated this. His men parted ranks at the last moment, letting the chariots pass harmlessly before cutting down the horses and drivers. Then came the main assault. Persian cavalry swept in from both wings, seeking to envelop the Macedonians. On the left, Parmenian's forces were pressed hard, fighting desperately to hold their ground. On the right, Alexander executed his bold gambit, feigning a retreat to draw the Persian cavalry away from the center. The hammer strike as the Persian horse pursued. A gap opened in the enemy line, a fatal weakness. Alexander wheeled his companion cavalry and charged straight into the breach, aiming directly at Darius himself. The king's chariot became the focal point of the assault. Amid the chaos, Alexander's spear struck down the royal guard. Arrows whistled past him, swords flashed, horses screamed. Darius, seeing the Macedonian king bearing down upon him, lost his nerve. Just as at Issus, he turned his chariot and fled the field, his guards scrambling to follow. The sight shattered Persian morale. Their center collapsed, and panic rippled through the ranks. The turning point, but the victory was not yet complete. On the left flank, Parmenion still struggled against overwhelming numbers. Alexander faced a choice: pursue the fleeing Darius and end the war in a single stroke, or turn back to save his army. He chose his men. Leading his cavalry in a furious charge, he smashed into the Persian flank, relieving the pressure on Parmenion and securing the battlefield. By sunset, the field of Gaugamela was strewn with the bodies of tens of thousands of Persians. Macedonian losses were minimal by comparison, but the exhaustion was deep. Still, the truth was undeniable. The Persian Empire was broken. The king of Asia, in the aftermath, Babylon, opened its gates to Alexander without resistance. Darius fled east, still clinging to the hope of raising another army, but his authority was gone. Alexander entered the great cities of Mesopotamia as a conqueror, receiving tribute and pledges of loyalty. The world now called him King of Asia. Yet for Alexander, this was not the end. The road still stretched eastward, to Persepolis, to the edge of the known world, and beyond. Standing atop the walls of Babylon that night, Alexander looked out at the endless horizon, the torchlight flickering below. The greatest battle of his life had been won, but his hunger for conquest burned brighter than ever. Winter, 332 BCE, the deserts of the Near East stretched endlessly beneath the pale sun as Alexander led his army south along the Mediterranean coast. The Persian fleet still dominated the sea, but on land, the great king's authority was collapsing. City after city fell, either through force or surrender. Yet one jewel remained in Persian hands: Egypt. The road to Egypt. Egypt had been under Persian control for nearly 2 centuries, its people weary of foreign rule. Darius III's governors were hated for their heavy taxes and disregard for Egyptian traditions. For Alexander, Egypt was more than just another conquest. It was the gateway to the wealth of Africa, a breadbasket for his empire, and a land steeped in ancient mystery. But before he could march into Egypt, one obstacle stood in his way: the fortress city of Gaza. The siege of Gaza perched atop a high hill on the edge of the desert. Gaza was heavily fortified and commanded the main route into Egypt. The Persian commander, Battis, refused to surrender, confident the city's thick walls and elevated position would hold. Alexander ordered siege towers and battering rams to be constructed. For 2 months, the Macedonians fought a grueling battle, pushing their siege works through constant arrow fire. Several times, Alexander himself was wounded, once by a catapult stone that nearly crushed his shoulder, but he refused to withdraw. Finally, the walls were breached, Gaza fell, and Battis was captured alive. According to the ancient historians, Alexander, enraged by the city's stubborn resistance, dragged Battis behind his chariot, a grim echo of Achilles and Hector, before offering the city to his troops. With Gaza taken, the road to Egypt lay open. The welcoming of a liberator to Alexander's surprise, there would be no resistance. The Egyptians, seeing him as a liberator from Persian oppression, welcomed him with open arms. Priests, nobles, and common citizens lined the streets, offering garlands and gifts. In Memphis, the ancient capital, he was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt, adopting the title Son of Ra, the sun god. It was here that Alexander's image began to transform. No longer just a young Macedonian king, he was now a divine ruler in the eyes of his new subjects, a bridge between gods and men. The birth of Alexandria. During his stay, Alexander sailed down the Nile, marveling at the great temples, fertile floodplains, and colossal statues that had stood for millennia. Yet his vision was not bound by the past. He wanted to leave his own mark on Egypt. On the Mediterranean coast, at the mouth of the Nile, he chose a site for a new city, Alexandria. Designed as a great port and cultural hub, it would connect Greece, Egypt, and the East, serving as a gateway for trade, ideas, and power. Alexander personally sketched the city's layout in the sand, envisioning wide streets, bustling markets, and towering lighthouses. This city would become one of the greatest centers of learning and commerce in the ancient world, a living testament to his ambition. The Oracle of Siwa. Yet Egypt held one more mystery for Alexander. Deep in the Libyan desert lay the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis, a place where only the bravest dared travel. The journey was treacherous, endless dunes, blinding sun, and scarce water. But Alexander was determined to hear the voice of the god. Guided by Bedouin trackers, he crossed the desert. Legends say that at one point, a violent sandstorm threatened to bury the expedition. But 2 snakes appeared, leading the way to safety. Others claimed sudden rain saved them from dying of thirst. Whether truth or myth, the story only added to Alexander's mystique. When he finally arrived, the high priest greeted him not as a man, but as the son of Zeus. What was spoken inside the sacred chamber remains a mystery. Alexander never revealed the oracle's full words, but when he emerged, his expression was serene, as if the god himself had confirmed his destiny to rule the world. A king reborn. When Alexander left Egypt in 331 BCE, he was no longer just the king of Macedonia or the leader of the Hellenic League. He was Pharaoh, son of the sun, son of Zeus, a man whose power and divine status now stretched across continents. The Nile's waters faded behind him as he turned his gaze eastward. Ahead lay the heart of the Persian Empire, its jewel, Persepolis, still glittering in the distance. Darius III had not yet been caught, but Alexander's victory at Gaugamela had broken the Persian army. The time had come to finish what he had begun. The conqueror's journey was far from over. The deserts of Egypt had crowned him with glory, but the mountains of Persia awaited, and with them, the final act of a war that had changed the world. Winter, 330 BCE, snow dusted the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains as Alexander's army pressed eastward into the heart of the Persian Empire. The road to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital and treasure house of the Achaemenid kings, was steep, winding, and treacherous. Yet every soldier knew this march was not merely a military maneuver. It was the final step toward striking at the very soul of Persia. The gate to the heartland. To reach Persepolis, Alexander had to pass through the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass guarded by the satrap Eri. The Persian general, determined to halt the invaders, fortified the cliffs and blocked the road with stone walls and arches. When the Macedonians attempted a frontal assault, a rain of arrows and boulders drove them back. The pass seemed impenetrable. But Alexander was not a man to be denied. Guided by local shepherds, he led a detachment of troops on a grueling night march through freezing wind and treacherous terrain. At dawn, he appeared behind the Persian position, trapping Ariobarzanes between two Macedonian forces. The defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. The road to Persepolis lay open, the jewel of the empire. Persepolis was unlike any city Alexander had seen. Rising from the plain, its grand terraces, towering columns, and sculpted reliefs spoke of centuries of royal power. Gold and silver glimmered from palace walls, and the fabled hall of 100 columns stretched before him like a temple to wealth itself. The city's satrap, recognizing the futility of resistance, opened the gates. The Macedonians entered as victors, their boots echoing on the stone streets. For the first time, Alexander stood in the ceremonial seat of the great kings of Persia. The spoils of a continent within the royal treasury. The scale of Persian wealth was staggering. Mountains of gold coins, silver ingots, and jeweled ornaments, the accumulated tribute of an empire spanning 3 continents, filled vast storerooms. Historians estimated the haul at over 120,000 talents of precious metals, enough to fund Alexander's army for decades. Caravans of pack animals and wagons began the slow process of transporting the treasure westward. The conquest of Persepolis was not only a symbolic victory, it was an economic windfall that cemented Alexander's dominance. The burning of the palace, and yet, amid the triumph, a shadow fell. One night, during a lavish banquet, the question arose, what to do with the palace of Xerxes, the very ruler who had once invaded Greece and burned Athens. Some argued for preservation, others called for vengeance. According to ancient accounts, a courtesan named Thais, perhaps in jest, perhaps in drunken fervor, suggested they burn the palace as a fitting repayment. Whether spurred by impulse, symbolism, or alcohol, Alexander seized a torch and flung it into the palace. His companions followed, and soon the great cedar roof beams were ablaze. Flames devoured the heart of Persepolis, leaping into the night sky, casting shadows across the plain. The scent of burning wood and melting gold drifted for miles. Some historians believe Alexander later regretted the act, realizing he had destroyed one of the wonders of the ancient world. Others saw it as a deliberate message. The Achaemenid dynasty was finished, the end of an era. With Persepolis in his grasp and its wealth in his coffers, Alexander had achieved what few thought possible, the conquest of the Persian heartland. Yet the war was not over. Darius III still lived, retreating eastward to gather the remnants of his forces. Alexander would not rest until the great king was brought to heel, alive or dead. Standing among the blackened ruins of the palace, Alexander gazed toward the rising sun. Beyond the mountains lay more battles, more conquests, and the promise of lands no Greek had ever set foot upon. The burning of Persepolis was not the end of his journey. It was the spark that would carry him deeper into the unknown. Spring, 329 BCE, the ruins of Persepolis still smoldered in memory. When Alexander turned his gaze toward the rising sun, the Persian Empire was broken, its cities in Macedonian hands, its treasuries emptied. Yet one man still eluded him, Darius III, the last Achaemenid king. And beyond Darius lay lands Alexander had only heard of in legend, Bactria, Sogdiana, and the distant kingdoms of India. The conquest of Persia had been his father's dream. What came next was entirely his own. The hunt for Darius. Reports reached Alexander that Darius had fled east, seeking refuge among the satraps of Bactria. Determined to end the chase, Alexander drove his army through the Zagros Mountains into the high plateaus of modern-day Iran. The march was brutal. Cold winds, rocky passes, and hostile tribes slowed their progress. But in the summer of 330 BCE, news arrived that would change everything. Darius had been betrayed by his own commander, Bessus, who proclaimed himself the new king of kings. Before Alexander could reach him, Bessus murdered Darius and fled deeper into Central Asia. Alexander came upon Darius's body lying in an abandoned wagon. He covered it with his own cloak and ordered a royal burial in Persepolis, honoring his fallen adversary. He was a king, Alexander said, and I will treat him as one. But mercy for the dead did not extend to the living. Bessus would pay. Through the gates of Central Asia. To capture Bessus, Alexander plunged into the unforgiving terrain of Bactria and Sogdiana. lands of high mountains, arid plains, and fierce horsemen. The Hindu Kush rose before them, a wall of snow and stone. Crossing its icy passes tested even Alexander's hardened veterans. Frostbite, avalanches, and hunger claimed many lives. When Alexander finally cornered Bessus, the usurper was handed over by his own men. In a grim display of justice, he was scourged and executed for his betrayal of Darius. A war without front lines in these eastern lands. Conquest was not decided by grand battles but by endless skirmishes. Sogdian rebels struck from mountain fortresses, vanishing before the Macedonians could retaliate. Alexander responded with relentless pursuit, scaling cliffs and besieging strongholds in the dead of winter. One fortress, the Sogdian Rock, was said to be impregnable, perched high on a sheer cliff, defended by warriors who taunted Alexander from above. When they mocked him to find men with wings to take the fortress, he called for volunteers among his best climbers. Under cover of night, these soldiers scaled the icy cliffs with iron spikes and ropes, appearing at dawn like ghosts on the summit. The defenders surrendered without a fight. Love and alliance. It was in Sogdiana that Alexander met Roxana, the daughter of a local noble. Her beauty and intelligence captivated him, and their marriage not only sealed his control over the region, but also symbolized his vision of uniting East and West. The union was celebrated with feasts blending Greek and Persian traditions. Though some of Alexander's Macedonian officers grumbled at the king's growing affinity for Eastern customs, the call of India. By 327 BCE, Alexander's eastern frontiers were secure, yet his ambitions stretched further still. Tales from merchants and scouts spoke of the Indus River, of cities rich in gold and ivory, and of rulers commanding war elephants, beasts unlike anything his men had faced. With his army reforged and supplied, Alexander set out toward the Hindu Kush once more, descending into the lush valleys of the Kabul River. Here, he secured alliances with local rulers through diplomacy, marriage, or swift conquest, ensuring his rear was safe before pressing on. The crossing of the Indus. At last, Alexander reached the mighty Indus River. Vast and slow-moving, it marked the edge of the known Greek world. Crossing it was both a logistical challenge and a symbolic leap into the unknown. The locals, awed by the Macedonian king's reputation, offered guides and supplies. As his army ferried across on rafts and boats, Alexander stood on the eastern bank, watching the sun rise over a land no Greek had ever ruled. Somewhere beyond the horizon awaited King Porus, a ruler famed for his courage, and for the towering war elephants that guarded his realm. Alexander's march into India had begun. Summer, 326 BCE, the monsoon rains had not yet arrived when Alexander's army reached the lush plains of the Punjab. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers, a striking contrast to the arid deserts and frozen passes they had crossed. Before them lay the Hydaspes River, wide, deep, and guarded by the forces of King Porus, a ruler renowned for his valor and towering stature. The river standoff, Porus' army lined the far bank, infantry in gleaming armor, swift cavalry, and most fearsome of all, over 200 war elephants. The great beasts, their tusks capped with iron and bodies draped in armor, trumpeted in the humid air, their massive forms striking terror even in veteran soldiers. For days, Alexander and Porus stared at each other across the river, neither willing to make the first move. The Hydaspes was swollen with spring meltwater, its currents swift and treacherous. A direct crossing would be suicide. Alexander feigned inactivity, letting Porus believe he intended to wait out the season. But under the cover of night and a thunderstorm, he led a picked force, a priver, crossing in silence on rafts and makeshift boats. The Battle of the Hydaspes. At dawn, Porus realized the deception. He sent cavalry to intercept the Macedonian landing, but Alexander's horsemen smashed through them, driving them back toward the main army. The main clash came on the open plain. Alexander's cavalry swarmed the flanks, while the Macedonian phalanx advanced against the elephants. The beasts charged, tusks goring men and horses, their sheer weight breaking formations, yet the phalanx held, spears stabbing at the elephants' eyes and legs until the great animals panicked, trampling friend and foe alike. Porus fought from horseback in the thick of the melee, his massive frame towering over his men. Even when wounded, he refused to retreat. The meeting of kings. After hours of brutal fighting, Porus' army broke. Surrounded, the king finally surrendered. Alexander, impressed by his courage, asked, "How would you wish to be treated?" Porus replied, "Like a king." Smiling, Alexander restored Porus to his throne, granting him more territory and making him a loyal ally. It was a gesture that reflected Alexander's growing vision, not merely to conquer, but to integrate the lands he ruled. The edge of the known world from Paris court. Alexander planned to march east toward the Ganges River. Scouts told him of kingdoms larger than any he had faced, of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But when he presented the plan to his troops, a murmur of dissent swept the camp. These men had followed him for nearly a decade, through deserts, mountains, and endless battlefields. They were weary, longing for home. The thought of facing yet another vast army in an unknown land broke their resolve. At the city of the Hyphasis River, the soldiers refused to march further. For the first time, Alexander faced open defiance from his army. He withdrew to his tent, furious and silent for 3 days. Finally, he emerged, conceding to turn back, but only after erecting 12 giant altars to mark the easternmost point of his campaign. The journey home turns bitter. The march back west was far from easy. Alexander decided to split his forces, part traveling by sea under Nearchus, the rest marching through the Jedroshindes. The desert proved a greater enemy than any army. Blazing sun, shifting sands, and scarce water killed thousands. Men collapsed in the heat, their armor scorching to the touch. One day, scouts brought Alexander a helmet filled with precious water, enough for a single drink. In full view of his soldiers, he poured it into the sand. "If my men cannot drink," he declared, "then neither will I." The gesture rekindled their loyalty, but it could not bring back the dead. Toward Babylon. By the time the army reached the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in 324 BCE, they were a shadow of their former numbers. Yet their return was greeted with celebrations, for they had marched further than any army in history, reaching what Greeks believed to be the ends of the earth. Alexander, however, was not done. His gaze turned once more toward new conquests, Arabia, perhaps even the mysterious lands beyond the sea. But fate had its own designs, and the journey that had begun in Macedonia was drawing toward its final chapter. Spring, 324 BCE, Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, shimmered in the heat as Alexander's army entered the city. Towering walls, lush gardens, and bustling markets testified to centuries of prosperity. Yet on this day, it was not the city's beauty, but the triumph of its conqueror, that drew the crowds. Alexander had returned from the ends of the earth, his conquests stretching from Greece to the Indus, and the world hailed him as a living legend. The king of kings in the palace once ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander received delegations from every corner of his empire. Envoys from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India brought tribute, exotic animals, and rare treasures. Musicians played songs in dozens of tongues. Dancers performed in styles from as far as the Hindu Kush and the Nile. Yet amidst the celebrations, Alexander was restless. The map of his empire filled the room, and he saw only unfinished business. His mind was already on the next campaign, the conquest of Arabia, and perhaps beyond, to the distant lands hinted at by sailors' tales. The marriage at Susa, in a grand gesture to unite East and West. Alexander staged the mass wedding at Susa. Thousands gathered as he and his generals married Persian noblewomen, blending Macedonian and Persian bloodlines. Alexander himself wed Stateira, the daughter of Darius III, even as he remained married to Roxana. To the Persians, it was a sign of respect. To the Macedonians, it was a troubling sign of their king's shifting identity. Whispers began to circulate that Alexander was becoming more Persian than Greek. Tensions in the ranks, years of relentless campaigning, had hardened Alexander's army, but it had also frayed their loyalty. The introduction of Persian troops into the companion cavalry, the adoption of Eastern dress and court rituals, and the king's demand for proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing to the ruler, alienated many Macedonians. One day, during a feast, a drunken quarrel erupted between Alexander and his old comrade Cletus the Black. Cletus accused Alexander of forgetting his Macedonian heritage, of claiming divine honors like a Persian despot. In a flash of rage, Alexander seized a spear and struck Cletus dead. When the wine wore off, grief and guilt consumed him. For 3 days, he refused food and drink, mourning the loss of a man who had once saved his life at the Granicus. The shadow of conspiracy. As Alexander sought to weld his vast empire together, darker currents swirled beneath the surface. The execution of Philotas and his father Parmenion years earlier had already sown fear among the high command. Now, rumors of plots multiplied, some real, others imagined. One such conspiracy emerged in the form of Harpalus, a trusted treasurer who fled Babylon with an immense fortune, seeking refuge in Athens. His betrayal fed the suspicion that even those closest to Alexander might turn against him. The march to Arabia, despite the tension, Alexander pressed ahead with preparations for his Arabian expedition. Massive warships were constructed, harbors expanded, and maps drawn. The plan was bold, a naval and land invasion that would secure the empire's southern flank and open new trade routes. But as the fleet assembled on the Euphrates, omens began to trouble the court. A lion escaped from the royal menagerie and was killed by a donkey, a sign, some said, that the great would fall to the lowly. Priests whispered warnings, but Alexander dismissed them. He had faced storms, deserts, and armies. What could fate do to him? A king alone in his private moments. However, Alexander felt the weight of isolation. Many of his oldest companions were dead, others alienated, and new advisors were often Persians or foreigners. His vision of a united empire was grander than anything the world had seen, yet it left him surrounded by courtiers who feared him, soldiers who questioned him, and allies who measured his every word for weakness. Still, his eyes burned with ambition. Arabia was only the beginning. He dreamed of circumnavigating Africa, of reaching the distant ocean sea that encircled the world. In his mind, there was always another horizon to chase. The final banquet in the early summer of 323 BCE. As the Arabian campaign neared its launch, Alexander hosted a grand banquet in Babylon. Wine flowed, music filled the air, and the king toasted to the glory of the gods and the unity of his empire. No one knew it then, but this feast would be the last time Alexander's generals would see him in full health. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world was about to meet the one adversary he could not defeat. Early June, 323 BCE, the sun blazed over Babylon, casting long shadows across the city's great walls and hanging gardens. Inside the royal palace, Alexander walked the colonnaded halls, inspecting maps, speaking with generals, and finalizing plans for the Arabian expedition. His fleet was ready, his supplies stocked, and his ambitions unshaken. Then, fate intervened. The sudden illness. After a long day of ceremonies and planning, Alexander attended a banquet hosted by the Admiral Medius of Larissa. Wine flowed freely, laughter filled the hall, and the air was heavy with the scent of roasted meats and burning incense. That night, Alexander complained of fever. By morning, his condition had worsened. Still, he pushed on, meeting with his commanders and overseeing preparations for departure. But each day, the fever climbed higher, sapping his strength. Within a week, the conqueror who had crossed deserts and mountains could barely stand. Whispers in the palace. As news of his illness spread, Babylon became a city of rumors. Some whispered of poison, claiming a jealous general or a political rival had struck. Others believed the gods themselves had decided that no mortal should hold such power. Alexander himself, lying on his bed in the palace, seemed less concerned with blame than with the future. He asked his officers about the state of the army, the readiness of the fleet, the loyalty of his satraps. Even as his body failed, his mind was on the empire he had built. The river of silence. By the 10th day, Alexander could no longer speak above a whisper. His generals crowded around his bed, each desperate for a sign, a word, an order. When asked to name his successor, he is said to have replied only, "To the strongest." Whether it was a challenge or a curse, no one could say. His soldiers, many of whom had followed him for over a decade, were allowed to file past his bed. Too weak to speak, Alexander still met their eyes, acknowledging each man with a faint nod. Hardened warriors wept openly, knowing their king's light was fading. The death of a titan on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander breathed his last. He was 32 years old. The man who had conquered more of the known world than any before him lay still, his body draped in royal cloth, his golden diadem resting beside him. The palace fell into chaos. Without a named heir, his generals, the Diadochi, began maneuvering for control. The unity of his empire would not outlive him. Within years, it would fracture into rival kingdoms. The immortal legacy. Alexander's body was placed in a gold sarcophagus, later transported to Egypt and displayed in Alexandria. the city he had founded that would become his greatest memorial. Pilgrims, kings, and emperors would visit his tomb for centuries, seeking inspiration from the man they called Megas, Alexandros, Alexander the Great. Though his empire crumbled, his legacy endured. Greek culture, language, and ideas spread across Asia and North Africa, blending with local traditions in what history would call the Hellenistic Age. Cities he founded became centers of learning and trade. His name entered legend, a symbol of ambition without limits. The final image, some say that in his last conscious moments, Alexander imagined himself back at the tomb of Achilles in Troy, the wind in his hair, the promise of glory before him. Whether or not it is true, the image endures. A young man standing at the edge of the world, staring into the horizon, certain that nothing was beyond his reach. In the end, Alexander's life was both a triumph and a warning, proof of what vision and courage can achieve, and a reminder of how quickly it can all vanish. Yet his story, once begun, could never truly end. For as long as men dream of conquest, they will remember Alexander the Great, the man who sought to unite the world under a single crown, and in doing so, became immortal.